Are we too afraid of ultra-processed foods? Is it really the all-bad, gut-devouring, addict-inducing boogeyman we've all learned to fear? Or is it okay to have the occasional bite? I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast, we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science and medicine. There's a clear correlation between ultra-processed foods and obesity. And in the quest to find out why it's seemingly making us put on the pound so fast, scientists have understandably been looking at every mechanism of ultra-processed food. Is it the additives or the preservatives or the emulsifiers? Is it upsetting the balance of microbes in our gut? Is it throwing our hormones out of whack? Or is it perhaps something much less complicated? Today I'm joined by Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, who's been warning us about ultra-processed foods and their harms. But today, I want to take a different approach and uncomplicate the conversation, throw some nuance in, explore why not all ultra-processed foods are created equal. And I also want to acknowledge that for some people, ultra-processed foods are an essential, budget-friendly solution to eating. If you want to feel a little less guilty about the food you eat, this one's for you. Chris, great to have you on. It's like a part 2 of our Instagram live that we did.
I'm very pleased you're doing this, and you've got your kind of modern podcaster aesthetic going really well.
You know, I really want to get you on because ultra-processed food, that's like a buzz phrase over the last couple of years. And, you know, you wrote a whole book on it as well. And I can't think about much else when it comes to nutrition. Like that, the top of the tree when it comes to nutrition facts and online circles seems to be ultra-processed foods and additives. And you can also draw a correlation between rising obesity rates, rising chronic disease rates from cardiovascular disease to metabolic diseases to cancers even. And you can chart, you know, that parallel between our diets and how they've changed over the last few decades, as well as other factors as well. But diet seems to be one of the biggest changes in our recent history. And that's also correlated with a negative influence on our health. Now, do you think that ultra-processed food is the common denominator in all these things, or is there something more to it?
The big question when you do the kind of studies where we study things that cause human health problems, the question is the thing, like a cigarette, causing the health problem, or is it actually the matches that the smokers buy and the cigarettes are just associated with the health problem? And there are all kinds of pitfalls when you're doing big population research around this. So as a result, we've got a very formal set of criteria that we use to evaluate epidemiological evidence, population evidence. They're called the Bradford Hill criteria. I'm sure you know them very well. But when we ask the question, are we sure that a dietary pattern high in ultra-processed foods, so we're not asking about like, is a particular product harmful? We're saying, is eating lots of this kind of food, does it cause what we euphemistically call negative health outcomes? I think it's very, very clear that it does cause that. Now, and I can go through that individually. There is a fiddly addition to this question, which is ultra-processed food harmful because of the processing, or is it because it's just high in fat, sugar, and salt? And that's a sort of subsidiary, nerdy, technical policy question. And I can answer that question as well. But
is it just purely a policy question, or can we say that anything, regardless of its ultra-processed status, which is high in fat and sugar, can also cause negative health outcomes, as you suggested, if consumed beyond a certain limit? For example, if I got some sweet potatoes, cut them into fries, just added salt and oil, but overconsumed that, and it's easy to overconsume that because of the properties of sweet potato fries. They're relatively smooth and easy to absorb and chew, etc.
You have the tone of someone who makes a good sweet potato fry.
I do, in fact, yeah.
Is the recipe going to be available later on the
link in bio
on your site? Exactly. Well, look, this is a really important point. So I think we can be very sure, and I can go through this in detail, that a dietary pattern of ultra-processed food causes negative health outcomes. But there's a really important thing when you're taking all that evidence, and there is now a huge amount of evidence, and creating policy. one of the big questions is it only ultra-processed food? And you are exactly right that you can make harmful food at home. And there is some harmful food that's industrial that doesn't meet the definition of ultra-processed food. So the definition by now, lots of people will be familiar with. It's very long, but it boils down to kind of food with additives, made using additives and processes that are exclusively or predominantly of industrial use. So the case of most crisps are ultra processed because they contain flavoring and emulsifiers and lots of agents you don't use in home cooking. But if you look at ready salted crisps, slices of potato fried in oil covered in salt, they don't technically meet the definition of ultra processed, and yet they have many of the properties of harmful food. So the way I think about this is that there are certain things that there's very little that's agreed on in nutrition, but there is a short list of stuff. When you look at a thing that you're eating, whether it's a product or a meal at home, there are certain things about that meal or food that we're pretty sure about. That high levels of salt, sugar, saturated fat, they do drive harms. And we're also pretty sure that foods that are soft and energy dense, so that have a lot of calories per 100 grams, we're pretty sure that those things are harmful. And all of these those kind of 4 or 5 things, they all drive slightly different problems. Sugar drives weight gain and metabolic disease. Salt drives cardiovascular disease. Saturated fat drives atherosclerosis, but not obesity, interestingly. And then energy density and softness generally make you eat too much. So the big question is, the critiques of the ultra-processed food definition, which is a formal scientific definition, say, look, it's a very, very big category and it provides no gradation. So it includes a huge number of products and it doesn't make any distinction between ice cream, ultra-processed bread, and most breakfast cereals. And the answer to that question at that point is it's quite a valid point in some ways, but the definition ultra-processed food was never intended for your listeners to go to the supermarket and try and work out what they should and shouldn't be eating. It was a research tool designed to explore a dietary pattern and work out whether an influx of industrial food to a country harmed human health. It's a great research tool. It's a lousy consumer tool, and it's a lousy tool for regulation. And so one of the things we can do to regulate harmful food, that there are then 2 things that it's really important to say. Absolutely no one thinks that domestic cooking is driving diet-related disease in the UK. Now, yes, sure, historically, if we rewind the clock 50 years to when there was much more domestic cooking, there was a certain amount of childhood obesity, 2-3%, something like that. Okay, at the moment, kids at the age of 10, kids at the age of my eldest live with 25% obesity. So, domestic cooking, we can deal with domestic cooking once we've solved all the other problems. There is consensus that the products that need regulation are pre-prepared, packaged, industrially processed goods. And then the debate is, how are you going to regulate them? Are you going to put an ultra-processed label on them? Well, no one serious is proposing that. We take the evidence about ultra-processed food, and then we can use fat, salt, sugar, and calories to label 99% of ultra-processed products and to label all that other stuff that doesn't quite meet the definition of ultra-processed food.
I mean, when you point out that obviously this ultra-processed category contains things which we don't want in those amounts. So, for example, saturated fats, low in fiber, high in calorie, high dense foods which maybe aren't satiating and have potential additives. And this is where I wanted to really discuss with you on as well, the emulsifiers and additives and various other chemicals, which, some people tend to fearmonger online. There's evidence for and against, these additives. For example, some studies might say that these emulsifiers and additives might have a small effect, which, in isolation or in a day or a week may not have a significant impact, but consumed over many months and years may have a plausible reason, a mechanistic reason to impact someone's gut physiology, metabolism, and so on, and drive disease. And that's fair enough. And I don't think we can 100% say that is definitely true because we don't have that follow-up data yet, but cautiously watching that space. But then you can also say that what is the net gain of such a food? For example, we know a lot of these ultra processed foods are ultra processed cereals targeted at young children. And these might also be fortified in folate and iron. So, is the net gain and the net positive of some ultra processed foods better than driving people away from those things, especially people who may not be able to afford something not ultra processed in terms of their morning breakfast, for example?
So this is a really important question, and it's one of the reasons when you come to regulate ultra processed food and lots of other processed foods, you have to do it with great nuance. And it's certainly true that shoving kids away from a marginal product like Weetabix, you could argue because it's got a flavoring in it. You could say, well, is it ultra processed? I mean, it's mainly whole food, and it's a pretty good food, and it's fortified. So I think no one serious who studies food says that all ultra processed food is equally harmful, nor that we should ban any of it, nor that we should tax it all universally. Although most of us, I think, agree that the worst products almost certainly should be taxed. I guess for me, when we look at the evidence around ultra processed food and we say we've got this population epidemiological evidence, but mechanism, having a sort of plausible experimental evidence and understanding the mechanisms it might do harm is really, really important. My group at UCL have done a formal analysis and looked at levels of salt, saturated fat, and sugar in ultra-processed food products. So we could look at those breakfast cereals that you point at, and they're marketed at kids. And we would say, well, yes, they do contain some iron, some fortification, absolutely. We're not entirely clear how good or important that is compared to getting nutrition from real food. But more than 90% of those breakfast cereals marketed directly at kids will have excessive amounts of salt and sugar. And the same will be true for almost all of the products that people point to. So if you look at statements by things like the British Nutrition Foundation, they come up with, an industry-funded scientists do this. There's a kind of laundry list of healthy ultra-processed products: fish fingers, baked beans, UPF whole grain bread, breakfast cereals, flavored yogurts. This is the list. Are they all as harmful as candy bars? Absolutely not. But if you look at those products one by one, almost all of them have excessive amounts of energy, fat, sugar, and salt. So saying that these things are healthy, are they the worst things? No. But should they be the foundation of our national diet? No, they shouldn't. I mean, baked beans are a good example. Baked beans definitely have some fiber, but they're massively high in salt, sugar, and energy. So there probably should be some warnings on tins of baked beans and fish fingers and whole grain bread. Whole grain bread's another good example. It's incredibly salty and often very sugary and often quite fatty and extremely energy dense. So are they the worst things? No. But should we be trying to shift people to whole food or real food alternatives? I think there would be great benefit in doing that. The difficulty, as you point out, is the economics of it. Real food is expensive in terms of time, times of actual money, and in terms of equipment, and it requires much more education. So I think it's one thing to say we are sure. I think that a dietary pattern of ultra-processed food is harmful. We're sure about that. We've got a very clear understanding of the mechanisms by which it does harm, some of which are very well understood: fat, salt, sugar, energy density. The additives, maybe. I'm less worried about the additives, although I think some of them are concerning, and we can talk about that. So you can say, well, there's all the scientific evidence, but how you turn that into policy that improves health justice, reduces health inequalities, doesn't make people's lives less convenient or unfair, and it doesn't diminish their opportunities or limit their freedoms. I think those are very vexed questions, and that's what I'm kind of in the weeds of at the moment. So I'm very conscious we mustn't do those things.
One thing which I think I'm confused about, or let's say cynical about when it comes to ultra-processed food, is not that inherently, yes, should we be encouraging food policy to regulate it more and push us as a nation and globally towards whole foods? Totally agree on that. But for example, if you gave two people who are identical in pretty much every single way, one consumed all their calories for that one meal from almonds, for example, whole almonds, and someone else consumed the same caloric intake of those almonds, but from almond butter, just crushed almonds and made into a paste, that is ultra processed, that almond butter. And the caloric absorption and the caloric yield that would provide would probably be significantly greater than the whole almonds, but only because predominantly it is easier to eat because it's in a paste form, so it can be absorbed easier. And also it can be potentially easier to be overconsumed because it is soft. So is the main issue with ultra-processed food and the correlations we have with these kind of poorer health outcomes because they're potentially tastier, because they're easier to overconsume, and because when food travels through our gut, they provide a greater absorption of calories. So we absorb more calories from these processed versions rather than some magic unseen quality in ultra-processed foods, which kind of bewitches our bodies and says, okay, it's going to cause you harm.
There's a lot to answer there. If you eat 500 calories of almonds or 500 calories of almond butter or 500 calories of chocolate spread, again, it's quite widely agreed in nutrition that 500 calories is 500 calories. And the issue with the ultra-processed food is that you eat generally more than 500 calories. So given, and we now have 2 randomized controlled trials of this, but many, many, many other experiments on ad libitum food intake, on the properties of food. And the reason ultra-processed food drives weight gain is because we eat too much of it. So if we just look at that one, I mean, the epidemiological evidence has now linked ultra-processed food to chronic kidney disease, multiple cancers, anxiety, depression, inflammatory bowel disease, early death from all causes, cardiovascular disease, and on, metabolic disease. But weight gain and obesity is the easiest thing to focus on because we've probably got the most evidence. So why does ultra-processed food lead to weight gain? Because you eat more of it. And that's very clear. Why do you eat more of it? We can be pretty sure about probably 4 or 5 aspects of most ultra-processed products. And this is a general comment on industrially prepared food. They're soft. And softness isn't something we regulate, but we have very, very robust evidence that if you think of that supermarket bread compared to if you go and get some German pumpernickel, to eat the same number of calories just takes you longer. And while you're chewing, you know this better than me, we get satiety signals, hormonal and neural from the gut and from the mouth. So eating slower because food is chewy slows you down. Energy density is important, and ultra-processed food tends to be extremely energy dense. There are a lot of calories per 100 grams. So if you look at something like a cheese puff, it doesn't feel heavy, but it's very energy dense. Per 100 grams, it'll have 500 calories or so. So those properties force you, drive excessive consumption. But the main thing, you talk about this magic property, and there is almost a magic to it. So I have interviewed now probably approaching 100 scientists who work within the food industry and develop these products. And they have if you take any of the typical products that you go and buy in the shop, think of your favorite chocolate bar, your favorite breakfast cereal. You and I have been able to buy those breakfast cereals and chocolate bars since we were little kids. There has been 40, 50, 60 years of food development technology put into them, many thousands of hours of focus testing. And lots of the food companies use MRI scanners and very advanced analytic techniques to optimize all of these products for individual consumption. So we know that the color of the pack, the cartoon character, the jingle, the snap or pop or crackle as you open the lid, the sound the product makes as you crunch it. They perfect the sonic branding, the way it sounds inside your head and outside your head when you're chewing it. Let alone the flavor combinations, the pH, the viscosity, the shear forces required to dissect it. So in the end, what you've ended up with is the optimization within any single product of hundreds, possibly thousands of different properties of that product. So the food becomes very, very hard to stop eating. And there is a kind of magic because while the food companies can tell you about some of how they do this, and I've got lots of whistleblower testimony about this, actually a lot of this is done through focus group testing where they just take 3 different formulations of the breakfast cereal. One's got a slightly different emulsifier. One's got a little bit less salt. The other has more sugar. whichever one people eat the most of and the fastest, that goes on the shelf. And 6 months' time, they try it again. And 6 months' time, they try it again. So the dials on every aspect are turned up to 11. And I'm not sure even in the food company labs, you could take any of these breakfast cereals and go, what exactly is it that makes my 7-year-old, and this is true, my 7-year-old eat 5 adult portions of one of these breakfast cereals? You know, we can point to some of the properties, the softness, the salt, the sugar, but others remain a bit invisible. They've just emerged from the evolutionary testing of the product. Does that make sense?
So it's sort of like a Willy Wonka factory line where some magical quality and obviously this intense, labor-intensive marketing strategy, product testing strategy over decades has resulted in a hyper-palatable environment where actually it's just so addictive, independent of its kind of nutritional label. It's just basically optimized for human consumption in a way. It's optimized for our eyes, our nose, our mouth.
And put yourself in the position. So I've spoken to everyone in the food industry, from the bankers who buy and sell the companies to the CEOs of major food companies, all the way down to the people selling it into the product shops and the product development teams. And you just have to imagine, you know, when they tell you about what guides them, they're really, really clear. We have to sell as much food as possible, because if you're at food, if you run, you know, the KR food company and I've got the CVT food company, I have to sell more than you. You know, we're in competition. So the system, a lot of my recent work's been with economists. And one of the things we've used is food company financial data to show that all of the incentives are financial. And when you look at some of the really big companies, Danone is a great example. Emmanuel Faber was the CEO of Danone. And I think he really wanted to make Danone healthier. And so he said, we're going to change all this. We're going to sell healthy food. And he was fired by activist investors. So even within the companies, people are very unable to change. The companies aren't in control of the business model, which is why I argue for government regulation, not for voluntary systems that we have in place in the UK at the moment. We need government to say, you know, and then we know that Danone and Nestle and Coke, if regulations are imposed on them, they're actually okay with that. And people within major food companies have all said in private, and some of them are on the record, we would love more regulation because we actually hate selling this. You know, you described it as addictive. That's a loaded term. I happen to agree with it, but there's legitimate controversy around it. But, you know, they hate selling addictive products that harm people. And that is what all these companies do.
It's the same as tech companies as well. Netflix, Apple, they make products which are designed to keep us hooked in that system, to want us to consume more, whether it's consume more TVs and binge watch TV series or get the new iPhone because it feels good in your hand or it's aesthetically pleasing. But I can't help but wonder, beyond those kind of magical qualities that you mentioned, whether it's that scarcity mainly of fiber in a lot of these ultra-processed foods. And we know that if you were looking for one nutrient which could come as close to a panacea for health as we could find, it would probably be fiber, because of the role it plays throughout the body systems and the gut microbiome, which we're learning more about. And we know that when populations and people have a higher fiber consumption in their diet, they'll feel more satiated and eat less because of these natural satiating hormones that are produced. And it happens to be that these ultra-processed foods have a dearth of fiber. And I guess the ultra-processed movement, as it were, leans heavily on that really major trial that happened in 2019 by Kevin Hall's group, the controlled trial where they compared a group of 20 people who are eating unprocessed whole foods versus heavily processed, ultra-processed foods over 2 weeks. And they found that the ultra-processed food group gained 1 kilo in weight over 2 weeks. And then you look at the sort of headline of that study, and it's basically saying that ultra-processed food is driving weight gain. But if you look into that study, the main difference, apart from obviously one is ultra-processed and one is unprocessed, was that the ultra-processed food group didn't have any vegetables. So if you add vegetables to ultra-processed meals, you could potentially dilute the energy density of meals. So, you could potentially be eating a ready meal every single day, but if you loaded it with veg, for example, would you then be getting not as bad a negative effect from the ultra processed food, because it's food is food, but actually you're now piling on the fiber and antioxidants and the phytonutrients from all the veg.
So Kevin's a collaborator and a friend, and Kevin's trial was, I would say it was an excellent trial when it was published, and it has been replicated. It's now really just one of, hundreds, probably more than 1,000 scientific papers, but it's still very important because one of the features is they adjusted for fiber between the two diets. So this trial, for those that aren't familiar with it, volunteers were fed 2 weeks on an ultra-processed diet, or there was a diet that was minimally processed. It was whole foods, but it was matched for salt, sugar, and fiber, and protein. And so the main effect was weight gain. So the fiber is a very, very important part of the story with ultra-processed foods, but we know that simply boosting the fiber in them on its own doesn't negate the weight gain effects. And my PhD student, Sam Dickin, did a systematic review of the literature. And of course, all of the papers that study the population data on ultra-processed foods do adjust for dietary patterns, salt, fat, sugar, and fiber. And what we see is when you make adjustments for fiber intake in the population data, the negative health effects, the fact that the food drives cardiovascular disease or weight gain, whatever you're looking at, remains the same, both in terms of its statistical significance, but also in terms of the size of the effect. So I think the lack of fiber is a massive problem with this food, and it's a big contributor. But in terms of excessive consumption, in terms of weight gain, I would say the food lacks fiber that fills you up. But the bigger problem is this food is engineered to drive weight gain. And your parallel with a phone or with tech, it's exactly right. I mean, if I look at my phone, which I have an addicted relationship with, I would say, what about my phone am I addicted to? Is it the camera? Is it Instagram? Is it the apps? Is it the music? Is it the fact it's a phone? You can't point to any one thing. It's the whole sleek package. I mean, you referenced it's nice to hold in my hand. So I think the fiber is a huge part of the story. The other thing, and I'd love your view on this, is there's some emerging evidence that all fiber may not be equal. So there may be fiber that you eat in the context of whole food and apples, some whole grains, a banana, wholemeal bread. And that fiber may be a bit different to the extracted fibers that a lot of food companies use to add to the food. So citrus fiber extract, for example. And I don't think we know much about this, but I suspect not all fiber I think fiber is probably not just fiber. I think it's probably a bit more complicated than that. Do you agree?
Well, I think the main problem is you're absolutely right that not all fibers are the same, and people have this sort of view of fiber as an umbrella term, but it's got individual components from prebiotics to insoluble fibers, soluble fibers and resistant starches. But the main problem that most of us have, particularly in the Western world, probably up to 90% of us, don't eat enough fiber. So if some of that problem is mitigated and offset by consuming added fiber from manufacturers adding in or fortifying products with fiber that's maybe not from real foods, then that's okay to sort of fill a gap, I think.
Oh, yeah. And if you're going to, people always say to me, like, what should I eat then? I'm like, well, eat anything. I don't have advice for everyone listening. Everyone's like, well, what should I eat? And I'm like, I don't know. I feed my kids baked beans on ultra-processed bread and fish fingers. They get that every week. It's not perfect. It's probably the least healthy thing they get. But if you're wondering what ultra-processed bread to buy because you live in the vast majority of the UK where you can't go to some fancy local bakery and get sourdough, like buy the whole grain ultra-processed bread. And that'll be better than eating a chocolate bar for sure. And a chocolate bar with nuts in it is probably going to be better than...
Or a higher, cocoa percentage or whatever.
Right,
it's making those sort of smaller gains, right? But what's your take on, for example... in this furor we have now of the UPF world, where that's really become a buzzword, it's also become associated with a degree of diet shaming as well, where someone who maybe for socioeconomic reasons or convenience reasons, relies on the majority of their diet being ultra processed. So I'm thinking, nurses on a night shift, or some truck driver who's making 14-hour drives every single week. What if they're reliant on the bulk of their food coming from convenient, albeit, trying to make it as healthy as possible, but UPF foods nonetheless?
I mean, I can't speak for everyone else. And I see a lot of stuff on Instagram where people seem to be saying, don't eat UPF or don't eat processed or don't eat seed oils. There's so much of this stuff. All I can say is that my ambition with all of my advocacy, my research, and the book I wrote is to reduce weight stigma particularly, but the stigma around diet-related disease. And so that's why I think I have never told anyone to not eat UPF. I feed it to my kids. I am privileged that I have, for the most part, an option to not eat it, but I am so clear that we need structural change. The reason, the barrier, I think, to policy change on this is the successive governments have been stuck going, we would like you to eat whole foods and minimally processed foods, and we suggest, avoiding synthetic emulsifiers in your bread, because the people would rightly kind of rise up and go, well, you're telling us to eat all this, but you've created market that prices food that is unhealthy and makes healthy food completely unaffordable. So there's a very deep problem of poverty and laying on top of that shame and stigma. And I work pretty hard to be alive to that and to not drive it. I was at an eating disorder conference last week because I work with a lot of eating disorders academics and that community to make sure that, both my research and everything I write and say is not driving orthorexia and fear of particular foods. I think it is really important that we find a way of critiquing food products, the food industry, and particular types of food in a way that doesn't shame people. I'm not sure there is a perfect way of doing it. And particularly in the field of eating disorders, there's a growing amount of evidence that we should be alive to the idea that foods engineered to interfere with your appetite, with your satiety, eating disorders may be a response to those foods as much as those foods are used to fix other eating disorders. And so these are conversations that are fraught with shame and complexity, and doctors are, in general, not enormously skillful at doing this. But yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of mainly acknowledge your point. I hope I'm not being too defensive and say, this is why my focus is on changing the food environment so that it is less stigmatizing and real food is available. And by the way, there is nothing I want to ban. And if people enjoy this stuff, then, I'm sure you're the same. Doctors smoke cigarettes. Doctors have tried booze. Doctors do all kinds of stuff. And but for our patients who struggle need better opportunities.
I totally agree that environment needs to change. And I guess the research of UPF highlights some of these systemic flaws that we've had, rather than driving that argument against banning or restricting certain foods. It rather highlights flaws in the nutritional landscape on a national epidemiological level from a policy and governance point of view. And that's where I find the resistance or inertia to change. For example, I made a YouTube video about Ozempic not too long ago. And, there are a number of factors which are involved in the obesity epidemic, as it were. It's not just this sort of didactic view that obesity or weight gain is because of someone's moral failure, or, they're just lazy or they're not exercising enough. There's a number of societal, psychological, microbiome and genetic factors, and food policy environment factors as well. And one of the things that I came across was the fact that in Chile, for example, they cut down and removed this sort of teen kid audience advertising, like removing Tony the Tiger from their Frosties or the Kellogg cereal, which can have a massive impact on that change of people making conscientious decisions to eat more nutritious foods. If we just have those small changes and reducing the amount of hours that kids are advertised to, in that sort of watershed time before the sort of adult stuff comes on, or just on, subways or whatever. It's, I guess I don't want to fearmonger people into the same way of tobacco, where you have, diseased lungs in a tobacco packet. You don't want someone's diseased colon on a crisp packet. That's not really appetizing. But I think we do need some more regulation there. But how is that going to happen now?
So look, there are. I love that question. So look, there are two things that I think need to happen. First of all, maybe you and I differ on this, but I would say, from my perspective as someone who does global health and a bit of public health, in the UK, we have some of the worst rates of diet-related disease of any comparable country. We have terrifying childhood obesity statistics. It goes hand in hand with malnutrition and stunting. And you are at the business end of the rise in gastrointestinal cancers. And so we're seeing this explosion of diet-related disease. I do not think that little tweaks are going to fix this. We need very significant regulatory changes. And there's quite a short list, because in the end, whether we call the food that's driving this problem ultra-processed or not, there is actually near total agreement that it is industrially prepared, pre-packaged food eaten outside the home, or prepared in a microwave inside the home, and it's typically high in energy, fat, sugar, and salt, and so that stuff is ultra processed. A margin of it isn't, and we need to regulate that stuff too. But we're all actually agreed on the products. No one, we're not harmed by cooking fatty food at home. So the question of how we regulate, if someone doesn't believe me on the ultra processed food evidence, I can do business with them. I don't care. You could take up all that ultra-processed food evidence, all the now more than 80 prospective cohort studies linking it to these negative health outcomes, all the hundreds of experimental studies, throw it all out the window. If that person said, but I am willing to regulate energy density, so calories per gram, saturated fat, sugar, and salt. And that is the system that they use in South and Central America. It works brilliantly well, because it's very hard to make harmful food or addictive food without it being either fatty, sugary, salty, or energy dense. And so once the difficulty is defining your harmful food, but you can use fat, salt, sugar, and energy, and use prepackaged goods. And then you need a whole suite of regulatory changes. You need to take the cartoon characters off the boxes. If we look at typical UK breakfast cereals, I mean, I'm going to use can I use a branded example? I've legally, this is all fact checked. So Kellogg's Cocoa Pops are an example of a cereal that I think traditionally most of us would agree, maybe it's not the healthiest start to the day. It's not a high fat, salt, sugar cereal according to UK law, and yet 17% of the calories in it come from free sugars. So it's like 3 times the recommended amount. It's also very high in salt. There's a monkey on the box, and the last box of Cocoa Pops I looked at had 12 separate health claims on it. So if we were to use the South American system, if we were to just use our own UK national guidance, we would take the monkey off the box, we'd have warnings for salt and sugar on the box, and we'd take all the health claims off the box, and it couldn't be advertised to children. Whether we put a picture of a diseased colon somewhere is that's a sort of a question for when we start to do anything that looks like regulation. But at the moment, we functionally do not regulate unhealthy food. I mean, there's just almost no regulation of it at all. My 7-year-old can go into any shop and buy a can of Coca-Cola. We don't even warn about tooth decay, which is, again, it's one of these things that we can all agree that sugary drinks rot teeth.
Yeah.
So the reason that none of this stuff, it's very well evidenced, it's happening around the world, it's happening in France, South America, it's even happening in North America. The reason it doesn't happen is because the food industry has a very, very tight grip on food policy in this country. And a British Medical Journal investigation 2 weeks ago published that 65% of the members of the government's Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition have financial relationships with big companies like Unilever, Coca-Cola, and Nestle. So until we release the grip of the food industry on policy, this is the reason we don't see change.
When you say release the grip of the food industry on policy, I mean, it sounds like essentially there are hands being inadvertently greased there. If we've got people at the top of food policy and regulating food policy in our own country having this conflict of interest and, the way I see it, bias, then,
Corruption would be
how
another
can
word,
it
but
change? And also, I see parallels between this and, for example, alcohol and tobacco. If we know now there's plenty of evidence over spanning decades that these are incredibly harmful for health, but they're still not really disappearing. And if anything, we buy more tobacco products, more vaping products, and more alcohol-based products than ever before because of, powerful lobbyists on their behalf.
So look, the tobacco point is so important because people, I've expressed that there are comparisons between the food industry and the tobacco industry, and people get horrified. What you have to remember is that in the mid-1980s, the biggest tobacco companies in the world bought the biggest food companies. So the food industry and the tobacco industry aren't just similar. They were the same industry for about 15 years. Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds bought General Foods, Kraft, and Nabisco, and became the biggest food companies. And we have lots of research now that if you are eating a product that was made by a company that used to be a tobacco company, they divested in the early 2000s. But if you eat products that were made by companies that used to be tobacco companies, they have a much higher hyperpalatability rating than other foods. So the parallels are important. As you say, that doesn't mean we stick all ultra-processed food in plain packages, but we do need to look at tobacco-style regulation. You ban the advertising, you put warnings on packets, but the most important thing that happened with tobacco, and alcohol is a much bigger problem now. Tobacco, we did get control of it. Now, you see in your clinical practice that still 10 to 15% of people in this country smoke. I mean, the smoking rates are wild, bearing in mind the tax and the advertising ban. But we've got it down from what it was. Alcohol, the alcohol industry runs our public health campaign. Drink Aware is funded by the alcohol industry. Gamble Aware is funded by the gambling industry, and the food industry has similar influence. So you have to make industry money dirty. Now, what's really important to say is the people on the advisory committee who have these financial relationships, they're mostly very decent people, right? This is all allowed. They're not breaking any rules. And so, and most nutrition research, probably most in this country, is funded by the food industry because they have so much money. But we need that government committee to become conflict-free, because until they do so, it's really hard to point at the food industry funded charities and the academic groups and the Science Media Center and get them to be industry free. But yeah, you are completely right. The conflicts of interest are at the heart of this problem. And I think that's why there is growing outrage when people discover that government advisors have relationships with these big companies.
Now, one of the things we haven't fully touched on, and I guess is an overlapping area of interest between what you're doing and what I am interested in myself, which is the gut microbiome, and certainly the growing understanding and at least research coming out, looking at the link and the interplay between additives, artificial sweeteners, components of ultra-processed foods, and what impact can it have short and long term on the gut microbiome and gut physiology. Now, a lot of the evidence that I've seen seems correlational in nature. A lot of it is observational cohort studies, snapshot cross-sectional studies, which suggest that there is some positive association between both those things. Now, what is harder for me to pick out is the ultra-processed food, which is driving obesity because of overconsumption, and the obesity and the sequential metabolic changes and changes that happen because of obesity, which we know can affect the gut profile and the gut microbiome, is that the sort of smoking gun between UPF and microbiome changes? Or is there something in UPF specifically, like the additives, which have a negative effect on the microbiome?
I mean, that's like a really fundamental problem for all microbiome research is do the changes in microbiome follow some other more important thing? I mean, the microbiome, I think, what do we know about it? We know it's probably the biggest immune organ in the body. We know it's very, very important. We know if you feed it the right stuff, it protects you in lots of ways. We know it produces vitamins and it's a sort of metabolic engine. Do we know exactly what a healthy microbiome should look like? There's not some kind of laundry list of these bugs you want. Do probiotics improve it? Probably not. Do prebiotics improve it? Probably, maybe not. I don't know. Do we think a healthy...
I would say that probably has the most research behind it for the prebiotics.
The prebiotics may do, and probably the best prebiotics are sort of whole and minimally processed foods. So
yeah, of course.
I think if I turn the question around and go, what are the things in ultra processed food? What are the mechanisms it does harm? We set additives to one side because in a way additives can be a distraction because they are regulated in this country. They're not acutely toxic. We're quite good at testing that. As you pointed out, what's really hard to do is to test an additive for its cumulative 10-year effect or its microbiome effects. And if you look at additive regulation, so the two big categories of additives that I think are worth discussing are the emulsifiers, which are the molecules in all our food that create smoothness and bind fat and water bits together. So, egg is an emulsifier, mustard is an emulsifier, but there are lots of cheap synthetic ones. And the non-nutritive sweeteners. Now, both have been shown to have microbiome effects in humans and animals. In simple terms, the emulsifiers, the other important thing that's an emulsifier is dish detergent because it takes fat off your, I know you know all this, but it takes fat off your dinner plate and links it to water in your washing up water and gets rid of it down the drain. And that's how it cleans your plates. So there is a simplistic idea that some emulsifiers may act like detergents in the gut, scrubbing out the protective mucus, scrubbing out the bacteria. And there's actually quite good evidence around that. There are Nature papers published on it. There is really good prospective population data on the emulsifiers. But the emulsifiers are all tangled up statistically with all the other harms of the food. So it's hard to work it out. The non-nutritive sweeteners, I think, are really worrying. So in simple terms, well, there's a very influential Nature paper published in 2014 about microbiome-mediated effects. There was a Cell paper published last summer. So Cell for the non-scientists is one of the highest impact, most rigorous scientific journals. Now, here's the way I always thought it worked. You put sweet taste on the tongue. This prepares your body physiologically to get sugar. So you put up a bit of insulin, your liver gets ready. You're like, okay, sugar's on the way. Not great, but I can deal with this. And humans are good at eating sugar, right? Like lots of people since antiquity, we've eaten lots of sugar. When that sugar doesn't arrive, so you get sweet taste on the tongue, no sugar arrives, we used to think it puts insulin up, that drops blood sugar, and then you feel hungry, so you eat more French fries. Now it seems like lots of diet drinks and lots of non-nutritive sweeteners, almost all of them, put your blood sugar up, even though they don't have sugar in them. And so I've started asking my insulin-dependent diabetic patients how they deal with low blood sugar, and lots of them drink diet drinks. So
interesting.
Why this happens isn't clear. It happens in humans and in animals. It's pretty well documented by now. So are non-nutritive sweeteners worse than sugar? I don't know. Probably not in most ways. Are they a panacea for all the problems of sugar? I would say definitely not. And I think we understand very little about these microbiome effects. So I think like you and I are on the same page of like a certain amount of slight cynicism about some of the claims around the microbiome, but I think it's really important, and I'm curious to know more. But there's also is it fair to say there's a lot of hype around the microbiome? There's a lot of money to be made out of it.
I think there is. I think, I'll come back to my slightly agreeing, slightly opposing view of the non-nutritive sweeteners just in a moment. But yeah, I agree. The gut health space is sort of, we're seeing the beginning of the wave of this kind of, charlatan pseudoscientists coming out and trying to make some money out of the gut health space. However, having said that, I think there is great potential in the future for probiotics for the average person as our science improves, because we know that for specific medical conditions, they work pretty well sometimes for certain post-bowel cancer surgery patients, for some post-antibiotic associated diarrhea, infant colic. There's good evidence for certain things. And I think our science will catch up with the enthusiasm in a few years. And I also think, we mentioned prebiotics earlier. I think prebiotics rather than probiotics are the most researched thing we have in the gut health space. And actually, prebiotics as a subset of fiber is actually probably even closer to a panacea that we have for certain things, because they directly are utilized by certain bacteria to produce good outcomes. And speaking to a few nutrition microbiome researchers from the University of Southampton, they are very sort of enthusiastic about prebiotics because it's essentially, a form of fiber, and you're not really standing on any shaky ground there because, there's decades of research into prebiotics.
I just want to see really good independent research, because I've fallen foul of probiotics. So probiotics are bacteria. And I celebrated some amazing sounding probiotic research, that I was doing it for the BBC and met these people. And then it turned out it was all debunked, and they had a company, of course, selling these bugs, and it all, So I think the hard thing is a lot of this is really promising. The one thing that there's consensus on is eating a whole food diet, like your whole grains, pulses, vegetables, fruit, bit of meat and fish, not too much, and not eating processed meats, ready meals, candy bars. There's really, we're really clear on this. And I think my understanding is a lot of what is good about whole food is that it's full of prebiotics. It's full of these fibers and probably there are lots of other phytonutrients and polyphenols and things that are also good for the bugs, aren't there?
I think the problem is, I don't have a lot of supplements in my house. So I have some protein powder, I've got some creatine, and I've got some psyllium husk, and I've got some prebiotic fibers. And, most of those I consume on a daily basis because they are leaning on years and years of research and they're convenient sources. I do eat a lot of fiber from foods, but I would say I'm eating close to 50 or 60 grams of fiber a day. And that's with these extra things as well. So I'm I would say in terms of fiber consumption, beyond the sort of average recommended amounts. And I don't really think there is an upper limit. If you don't have gut issues.
I love this. I think everyone listening, I'm going to go and eat some more fiber after this. Because what's really interesting, having this conversation with you is you're seeing a lot of this through that lens of fiber. And I'm like, yeah, well, we got to listen to you because you're seeing what happens when you don't get fiber every day. Whereas my kind of clinical experience is, I send those people to you.
Yeah, well, I'm scared into eating fiber because of the things I see.
Does all this, can I ask you a really personal question? Does all this make you kind of, how shall I put this, hard to live with? Like in terms of your bowel habit, wind,
No, I would say they're very in control, but I will say, without saying it, that I feel great in the morning after doing the business.
You're regular.
Every day is a great day for me because, I'm very regular. I'm like clockwork, literally.
And then also all the other thing is, and you will see this, but all my friends start to complain about this, is the piles, the anal fissures, the constipation, never mind the risk of cancer and inflammatory bowel disease. So that's the other thing, that once you're in your 40s, you're like, man, I've got to not get any more piles.
I mean, these are taboo things we don't like to think about in our teens and 20s or maybe even 30s. It's not exactly a romantic, date conversation about, what's your fiber intake
all
today?
My wife and I talk about these days.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Just to come back to your point about your last question that you posed, I guess, to yourself was sugar versus artificial sweeteners. And my take on that would be slightly different in terms of, I think a lot of people who cut down their sugar intake and then rely on these non-nutritive sweeteners like a Coke Zero, for example, to sort of compensate for that sweetness, but also reduce their calories, and thus, as a result, lose weight, and as a result, then improve their metabolic markers and profile, and then their gut physiology, then they reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, because of that weight loss and improved physiology. In those cases, artificial sweeteners, I think, helps those people.
100%. And if we were clear that scale use non-nutritive sweeteners as replacement for sugar did lead to weight loss, I'd be cheering for it. But that evidence is thin. I'm presuming we're going to edit this. Can I go and get my baby? Do you mind?
Of course.
So this is Indigo. I think this is her first media. I never made an announcement on social media. So you're getting like her world premiere.
So you've got your UPF expert on. So I mean, okay, we can't get rid of ultra processed foods in totality, nor should people look to zealously restrict UPF from their diet, because for a lot of people it provides convenience, things like whey protein, it provides fortification, fiber rich cereals for some people, and for some people it just fits in with their budget and it provides a chance for them to, I guess, go out and enjoy themselves.
Yeah.
So what are some solutions to live with UPFs but make them have less of an impact from your point of view?
I think there are two groups of people listening, and they will, I think you can probably all recognize yourselves. Some people are like the casual smokers and drinkers, and you're having, a pack of cigarettes on a Friday night, but not smoking Monday to Tuesday, or you're having a couple of big glasses of wine every night, but you're not drinking at 9:00 on a Monday morning. And those people with some information can shift to they can just cut down and that's fine. There is, I think, good evidence to say that, 10 to 15% of us live with an addicted relationship. Now, I think you can call this an addiction, but there's legitimate concern around that. But nonetheless, if you try and stop eating ultra-processed food because you think it's harming you, it's harming you, and you find that you're not able to stop, even though you want to, then that's sort of how we define addictions broadly and simplistically in medicine. And those people may find that making big efforts to be abstinent in some way may be helpful, but that itself will be hard because you are surrounded by it and it might be all that you can afford. So I don't give that as advice. If we look at countries with low intakes of ultra-processed food, there's lots and lots of very healthy food. So one of the things I think, I'm always torn between going, yeah, sure, it's fun. Yeah, great, do what you want. And going, actually, I think a bit like cigarettes and alcohol, most ultra-processed food is quite low joy. If you actually get it out and put it on a plate and go, let's sit, you and I. If you and I went out for dinner and we were going to, we could conceivably do this. And we went out and sat down and he came around to my house and I read, microwave some stuff. It's food that, because it's engineered to have that addictive property, it kind of satisfies some need and satisfies a craving, but it's not in itself very tasty. And there's quite a lot of research showing, that one of the things in the Kevin Hall experiment was the participants didn't find the ultra-processed food more delicious, even though they ate 500 calories more per day. So in terms of what to do, I don't have any suggestions really for individuals. What I want to do is create a food environment where real food is affordable, it's available, where ultra-processed food isn't marketed at children and adults constantly, so that if you want to stop eating it, and let's be honest, I think most people sort of do, that's much easier. Because if you imagine being someone trying to quit UPF on the modern high street or at a petrol station or in your canteen in your hospital, it would be impossible. It's just, that's not a question. There's no real food available and you wouldn't be able to afford it. So I think the current food environment, we talked about stigmatizing people around UPF. The food environment is what stigmatizes people. People feel this deep sense of failure and shame around their weight and around everything else. And I guess the sort of driving message of so much of what I do is to say to people, this is not you, it is the food. It's incredibly sophisticated. It's designed by some of the smartest people on earth and marketed by also some of the smartest people on earth. And if you can't resist it, that is because of the food itself. It's not because you are a deficient person.
How do you, with all this knowledge that you've accumulated over your years of clinical work, but also research, and specifically your research into, you poured into this book, the UPF book, how do you navigate your own day-to-day life, especially with young children yourself, and how do you restrict or not restrict their consumption of UPFs?
Well, so with my colleagues who work in eating psychology, eating disorders, there's one thing that everyone agrees on, which is that if you want to have the best chance of bringing up kids to have a healthy eating pattern as adults, you have to role model that. And eating as a table as a family, not in a car or in front of a television, is important. Eating fresh, real food with lots of nutrients in it is important. And also not fastidiously restricting stuff. So I've got two other kids along with Indigo here. They go to party, you know, they're at the age where they go to parties, and some weekends you have like 3 parties. So I say you can have whatever you want at the party, but my eldest is old enough to understand that, you know, fizzy drinks aren't great for her. And so I tell her that, but I say you can have them if you want. It's a choice you can make. And kids are smart, right? Like kids actually want to be strong and healthy and smart and do well at things. And so getting them to exercise a bit of agency from an early age feels to me important. Look, I've got a whole bunch of stuff I do, but I have not cracked this code, right? Like I don't know what's going to happen with my kids or with your kids or, you know, with anyone's kids, because the food environment is so difficult. But yeah, eat together as a family. And when your kids are bored and hungry, have a plate of chopped up fruit and veg ready for them. And they will, you know, kids will eat a bunch of apples and carrots if they're bored and hungry. They will not do it at the end of a you know, if you give them the sweets and the cake first. So there's like, that would be the other thing I do. But
you know, it's good to have this research into UPFs because it helps us to pinpoint flaws in our policy, as you've highlighted, but also the fact that I think we can potentially mix fear with our concerns about food. And as the research of UPF grows, we'll be able to stand on a bit surer footing. And I think at the moment, you know, like you said, I wouldn't want myself or anyone else to restrict something to the point at which it becomes problematic. But I think, yes, making conscientious choices to increase your fiber, increase consumption of whole foods, that will help, but also be accelerated by food policy, which I think is the ultimate sticking point and probably the rate determining step in improving our health as a nation.
I mean, you do it's what, and I wish I'd sort of been clear about this earlier in the podcast. You and I do slightly different things because people are coming to you for advice. I think people are like, what should I do? And that's awesome. And in a funny way, I because you are an expert on this stuff, because this is your clinical practice. In a funny way, my academic work is all food policy. My clinical work is infectious diseases and you know, so I'm really, really reluctant to give advice about this. I'm very focused on like change the food environment. And I think your message, when, you know, your listenership have come here and they're like, what should I do? And I think you serve that very elegantly by going, yeah, you don't have to fanatically restrict it. The French government are cool. The French government say get it below 15% of your calorie intake. If you're a typical person in the UK, ultra processed food is 60% of your calorie intake. So I'm happy to echo the French government, who I think the French know quite a lot about food.
No, I agree. No, but I think the work you're doing is important in the food policy space, and you know, for me, that does the environment that, you know, people often quote the phrase obesogenic environments. But you know, that is a thing, and that's the problem. We're surrounded with easy access to hyperpalatable, hypercaloric foods at the touch of a button, or Deliveroo app or Uber Eats. You can get all of these things, and you know, fast food at petrol stations. You know, there's probably a dozen McDonald's within, you know, a 10-mile radius of me. So we have problems when it comes to the food environment, sure. And I feel, you know, there's multiple stakeholders in raising the population's nutrition health.
I think that is right. My lens, and I think this is increasingly well evidenced if we look globally, is sure. It's like, I hear this a lot. There's multiple stakeholders. It's a complex situation. I'm more and more clear, and I would go toe to toe with anyone on this. The problem when we look at obesity in particular, the problem is industrially prepared, processed, packaged snack foods. That's it. You can call it what you want, but that's it. And the reason we eat so much of it is because of the food industry and their influence over food, over communication, marketing, advertising, promotion, government policy, the academy, charities, patient information, and on and on. There are lots of other little factors playing a role, but until we solve limiting industrial power over food policy, Everything else is just, you can all go home. Your listeners will be able to take your advice. Your listeners, educated people with resources, they'll be able to buy more fruit and veg, and I'm cheering for them. And that's great. But if we think of the population, I mean, you connect with a huge number of people, but if we think of really trying to get that childhood obesity rate down from 25% back to 5%, which was 1990, it's like, this has to be seen as a problem of industrial regulation. It's like tobacco. And the power of the ultra-processed food research is it squarely says the problem is the engineering of this food. The problem is the corporations. And that's the value. The policy stuff, as we've talked about, is kind of, there's a lot of line detail and nuance that needs to be hammered out. But none of it can be hammered out until you get industry out of the room.
Yeah, I think we're both allies in this sort of fight to raise nutrition. No, we are, and we come at it in slightly different ways in certain parts. But overall, I would say the majority we are sort of allied in our cause. And I also wanted to say, thank you for coming on and just providing a nuanced take about ultra processed foods and not being, the pendulum is not swinging one way or the other with you. You're sort of providing a pretty balanced view. And would you also say it's fair to say you've softened your stance a little bit on ultra-processed foods over the years, or?
I don't know. I had to rework the book for the paperback. And I'd say I've always been very clear. There's stuff that isn't ultra-processed that is harmful. And there's a spectrum within ultra-processed food. And the first draft of my book, so this was like written 3 years ago when I handed it into my editor, is very clear that the thing you regulate is fat, salt, sugar, and calories. So I don't know. Of course, I'm getting pigeonholed as like the ultra processed food guy. And there was someone described me as like the Taliban of ultra processed food, and it's like, no, I'm not sure I've softened because I've never been an ultra processed food fanatic. But I think I'm getting increasingly clear on the policy levers. We have to use the ultra-processed food evidence, but you got to use it. Policy and research aren't the same thing. The tool that works well in research won't work well for food regulation.
Hopefully we can, I would love to collaborate more with you on, helping you to.
I would love that. I mean, what you're doing is
about research.
It's so important having people like you. And one of the really big issues, so a lot of the stigmatizing stuff on the socials, bluntly, is kind of funded by industry. So many influencers who talk about food in a very kind of unpleasant way are just funded by the food industry. And it's not very hard to investigate it. So I think having independent people who are truly expert and who are at the sharp end of the kind of, you're seeing it in a way that very few doctors are, is just so important. So no, I regard you as a collaborator, Karan. I think of you as someone I lean on.
No,
and how to communicate. And all your questions today have just been about stigma, shame. How do we do this nicely? And so it's really useful for me to come on and be asked those hard questions of, I'm very conscious of it. There's no good way of defining unhealthy food. There's no way of talking about food that won't embarrass or shame someone. There's no way of regulating food perfectly. But none of those things mean that we couldn't do more than we're doing. At the moment, we're just going, well, we're just not doing anything at all in real terms that will dramatically change things. And we don't have a target either. I mean, I'd love to have a target and say in 20 years' time, childhood obesity levels will be back down to where they were 20 years ago. Why? I don't know why we can't have that as a target.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good aim. And also, after this conversation, I'm going to be more mindful of things I definitely pick out of the grocery store, and you're going to go away and eat some fibre.
I'm going to get some psyllium husk. What are you going to do? She's going to go and eat some boiled up broccoli. I think we're going to do that.
Thanks again to Dr. Chris Van Tulleken. What's your take on ultra-processed foods? Throw them all in the bin or eat in moderation? Let me know in the comments below. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast, and I'll see you donut divas next week.